We start today on Korea, and I want to talk about the Korean War, but I have to give some background to try to catch up what was happening in the Korean Peninsula uh, in the decades leading up to the Second World War and then immediately after the Second World War. That is crucial to understanding the start of the Korean War. Big question for this part of the unit will be what impact did other countries have on Korea's development? And you can see here, these are the flags of North Korea on the top and South Korea here below that exist today. A lot of background today, a lot more content than perhaps I usually give, but I do want to talk about what was happening before World War II, and then briefly at the end, the tail end of World War II, and then after World War II. That leads right into the Korean War in 1950. So hopefully it'll all make sense as we go through this. I'm going to move my head out of the way so you can see. So before World War II, Korea was the Choson Korea. Choson, different spellings there. But you can see the same peninsula here. This is the same Korea peninsula that we're used to. And it existed for hundreds of years. It was often referred to as the Hermit Kingdom because the Koreans often just wanted to be left alone and not really have to engage with a lot of other places. Um, the Japanese invade. You can see this green arrow with the dates here. The Japanese invaded in the late 1500s, and after that, the Koreans really pulled away from a lot of outside countries, wanted to be a little bit more secluded. So, but they did engage in trade with the Chinese and the Japanese to a certain extent in the decades afterwards. Just to give you some perspective here, these Asian countries existed for a long time. You can see that the Qing dynasty that we started the course off with began before our course begins in 1800 and it went into 1911. The Korean, it was the Choson Kingdom, then it became the Choson Empire. It went all the way up into 1910, but even before that, it had been around for hundreds of years. And then the Japanese had the Tokugawa shogunate for over 265 years here. But these countries lasted for a long time, much longer than a lot of students realize. And if you're an American student, you might not realize the United States of America is fairly young compared to some of these other countries around the world. So anyway, this government in Korea had been around for a long time, and they were really good at sort of just being left alone. They didn't really engage in a lot of other countries unless they needed to. Just to give you a fun fact here, the Koreans did not like the Qing dynasty. The Qing were Manchus. They considered them to be barbarians. They did not like the Qing. The Koreans liked the dynasty that came before. They liked the Ming dynasty, but not the Qing dynasty. So anyway, um, before World War II, so we're going to jump forward quite a bit now, significantly, so you can see the Japanese were constantly interfering with Korea in the 1800s. So in 1876, this was after the Japanese had established the Meiji Restoration with the Meiji Emperor. The Japanese had a treaty with Korea. Sometimes it's called the Treaty of Amity, sometimes it's called the Kangwa Treaty. But this treaty in 1876, it forced Japan forced Korea to open up the trade. So this was an unequal treaty. The British had done it to the Chinese after the First Opium War, Treaty of Nanjing. The Americans had done it to the Japanese after the Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with the Harris Treaty. And here, the Japanese are doing it to the Koreans. They're forcing them to open up, even though they don't want to. In 1894, there was an internal rebellion in Korea. It's called the Tonghak Rebellion. The Tonghak were just opposed to taxes and high interest rates and these kinds of things. So they started to rebel. The Korean king asked China to help. So the Chinese sent troops to try to help. Well, the Japanese also sent troops. So here you have an internal Korean rebellion with Chinese and Japanese troops both on the peninsula in Korea to try to stop these rebels. And the Korean king realized very quickly, oh no, this is bad, and so tried to settle things quickly with the rebels, which the Korean government did. They were able to put down the rebels, get them to surrender, but the Japanese and Chinese armies were already there on the ground. And if you've been paying attention throughout the semester, you will notice that 1894 is around that same time that the first Sino-Japanese War began. So an internal rebellion in Korea gave an opportunity for the Chinese and Japanese to engage in full-scale war between each other. One of the things that happened after the first Sino-Japanese War, after the Japanese proved themselves to be the most dominant country in East Asia, Ito, I've shown his picture before. He was influential in creating the Meiji Empire and helped to write the Meiji Constitution. Ito allied himself with Korea's crown prince, Iyun, and took him back to Japan, where he got a Japanese education, was part of the Japanese Imperial Army. And so the Korean crown prince stayed there for decades, wasn't even able to come back to what became South Korea, didn't come back until 1963. So that was one way that the Japanese exerted their influence over the Koreans. They have the crown prince. The Japanese also just took Korea outright in 1910. They just took the region. Here I've shown this map before. You can see Japan here. Here's Japan. And the purple areas are regions that Japan took, part of the Japanese colonies. They also took Korea in 1910. Now, right before this, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but right before this, the Korean king, had been trying to play the Russians off on the Japanese. And the Koreans had done this for a long time. They used to play the Chinese off of the British. When other Western powers wanted to come and trade with Korea, the Korean king would say, "Oh no, we're a tribute of China. We can't establish trade with you." You know, they would do the same thing here in the early 1900s. They would say to the Russians, well, maybe you should help us sort of play off the Japanese and the Russians with each other, and that worked for a little while. The Korean king could do that for a little while, but then by the early 1900s, 1904, 1905, there was a Russo-Japanese War. Japanese won again. After they defeated the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, they defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. And so the Koreans had no one left to play off against the Japanese. They couldn't do that at this point. So the Koreans were kind of stuck, and they became annexed. They declared their independence after World War I. So at the end of the war, remember there was the Paris Peace Conference and Woodrow Wilson's self-determination. And the Koreans declared themselves independent, but it didn't really matter because the Japanese still controlled the country. So having an independence, the Declaration of Independence, didn't really do a whole lot because they're still controlled by Japan. And so it's not a coincidence that you also see a communist party forming in Korea very soon thereafter, because there's a lot of frustration that the Koreans are not able to govern themselves, and they wonder if maybe the communists would give them some hope of being able to govern themselves. So during World War II, at the very end of the war, the U.S. was not focused on Korea. No one in the U.S. government really focused on Korea. They were very focused on Germany, they were focused on Japan, but they were not focused on Korea. And this is very sad for lots of reasons. One of the reasons being that the Japanese Imperial Army had been enslaving women to be sexual slaves during the war. And so I have shown this a picture of some comfort women who had been forced into essentially prostitution during World War II. And you can see most of these comfort women were coming from Korea, but they also came from other places like China as well. Japanese had a lot of control in East Asia. And then I've shown this picture before where even more recently in the 21st century, these women who are survivors of being comfort women have been protesting. They want to see the Japanese government apologize. They want to see some kind of restitution, and they still haven't gotten that. But the United States was not focused on Korea. Supposedly, the U.S. Secretary of State didn't even know where Korea was on the map. So didn't have any idea what was going on there. Also, the Japanese surrendered faster than anybody really anticipated in the U.S. So remember that the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on August the 6th, And then very soon thereafter, the Russians decided to attack the Japanese, and so they invaded Manchuria. When they invade Manchuria, though, here's all the brown areas, Manchuria that the Japanese control, all the way down to Nanking. This right up here is, they go into northern Korea. The Russians go into northern Korea, and they're not going to leave. So it didn't take the United States very long to realize, oh no, we better get some forces there too. And so after the war, the Koreans did finally gain their independence from the Japanese, but it's going to be a very short-lived independence because now we're going to have two zones of occupation between the United States and the USSR. And so you can see this here. Don't pay attention to this line here. This is the line that exists today. But back in 1945, the 38th parallel, this was the line of demarcation. This was the line that separated the Soviet zone in the north from the American zone in the south. And not everyone was exactly thrilled with this. Here you can see some Koreans who were protesting the fact that the Allies, the United Nations, most of the U.S. is there in the southern parts of Korea. So you have these two zones, and they're supposed to have elections. So in the southern zone, the Americans did have elections. They created the Republic of Korea. In the south, they had an election. And in the north, they're supposed to have elections, but not really. And they create the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And this is being established under the rule of Kim Il-sung, who is an important figure in Korean history. He is the first leader of North Korea, and we will read more about him later. His family uh, controls North Korea through the 21st century. So we'll look more at him later. So by the early parts of 1949, the U.S. and the Soviet Union leave. They leave the Korean peninsula, which is what they said they were going to do. Yay, that's good, right? But now we have two separate Koreas. Now, this is early 1949. At the end of 1949, Mao Zedong creates the People's Republic of China. It's a Chinese communist government. And when he does that, it makes Kim Il sung think, well, wow, the communists are able to rule China, and the Americans didn't do anything to stop them. So I want to rule all of Korea, and I don't think the Americans will stop me. So that was Kim Il sung's thinking. He talked to Stalin about it, about invading South Korea. Stalin was not thrilled about the idea of an invasion, but he did like Kim Il sung. He did support him, and so he reluctantly sort of gave his approval. And so you end up with this invasion in 1950. The North Korea invaded South Korea, and I'm going to go over this map here in a second. But you can see that the North had more industry, more military force, more experience. South had more people, though, and they did have the support of the United Nations, which at this point is really just the United States. Okay. Here's a Korean girl with her brother on the back walking past a tank. U.S. General Douglas MacArthur is put in charge of the armed forces. And so here I want to show you the maps. You can kind of see what's going on here. It looks like North Korea is going to completely overwhelm South Korea. They're just going all the way down to the southern parts, and they're invading. Well, then the United States, the UN forces begin to push back, and they go all the way across the 38th parallel. Now, the Chinese government had said, if you go across the 38th parallel, if you cross into North Korea, the Chinese government said, we will aid the North Koreans and we will fight against you. And General Douglas MacArthur didn't believe that, didn't think it was really a serious threat, invaded anyway. Well, lo and behold, here come the Chinese. They're crossing over the Yali River in October 1950. And here's the Yali River that separates China and North Korea. And so they push back, and they're pushing way back, going back into South Korea. The forces are overwhelmed here. And then we eventually have a stalemate where the two countries are pushed back close to the 38th parallel, but not quite. And that's where the line exists today. They signed an agreement, an armistice to stop the hostilities here. Casualties, just so you can see them. U.S. did lose 33,000. China lost 800,000, including Mao's son, which was important for him to be able to talk about how he sacrificed everything for the good of communism. The Koreans lose 3 million, either killed or wounded or missing. This today is the North Korean Museum of American War Atrocities. That's how they teach the Korean War to this day. And we have some sources I want you to look at. Do think about how these two different sources talk about the Korean War and who started the war. Think about that. This is a map of the Korean Peninsula to this day. You can see the light in the south. That's all I got, ladies and gentlemen. So have a great day. I'll see you next time.